Good morning. Happy story time, everybody. We are here finishing out the week with some quarantine story time. And as much of the US might be closing back down for more quarantine and shelter in place, we still have more War and Peace to read. So stay safe, read your War and Peace. Don't go to parties, people. Simple stuff. Wear your mask when you're not at home. So today we're going to do a slightly shorter reading, but that's because we're in volume 3, part 1, and we're just going to read to the end of part 1 so that Monday we can start fresh with volume 3, part 2. And I like to kind of honor Tolstoy's, the way he organized the book, because I think sometimes that really helps the flow. So because of that, we're getting kind of close to the end of volume 2, volume 3, part 1. So we're just going to finish it off. It's not very long today. And you guys can go about your happy Friday, your summer Friday, and hope you're staying safe while you're doing it, and just being careful using social distancing measures and being just alert and vigilant to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Also, Breonna Taylor's murderers are still not, have not been charged. She was killed in her own bed for doing nothing wrong, for not even like being a party to something wrong. And the 3 police officers who shot her in her home, one of them has been fired, and the other 2 are still working, and none of them have been charged with anything. And also, the warrant that they were supposed to be serving has suddenly mysteriously disappeared. So there's a lot that's wrong with this. But most of all, that a woman was killed in her bed for doing nothing wrong. She was shot in her bed. I think everyone can acknowledge that in America, you should be allowed to sleep in peace. And that's, it just boggles the mind that that's not somehow a big problem. That, because if it were a burglar coming and shooting someone in their bed, we would all also be like really outraged. But the fact that it's the law enforcement, that's the government, it's the people who are sworn to protect us, that their job is to make sure that people can sleep peacefully in their beds. I think that's pretty awful. So get some petitions, call some people, call the mayor. I'm going to get that. I'll try to get those numbers and things up that you can do. Also, there's so many cases that are still open or being reopened. Elijah McClain's case. So just check them out and see what calls you can make, and how you can continue to fight for justice in this country. We all should be able to live our lives as peaceful law-abiding citizens without getting murdered based on being misunderstood or villainized. I think we can all agree that should be a basic right in America, is that we should be able to be peaceful law-abiding citizens, without being murdered. So, yeah. But yeah, without further ado, let's jump back into War and Peace to finish this out. And as we saw, the last thing we were talking about was young Rostov boy Petya, who wanted to join the military. He's really quite young. It seems quite ridiculous. Also, Natasha Rostov is getting her former joyless life. And Pierre still thinks he's supposed to be somehow a part of defeating Napoleon. So let's just see where this all leads us. This is volume 3, part 1, section. Stood by Slobodski Palace. That's the palace where the sovereign was. The guest halls were filled. In the first were noblemen in uniforms. In the second, merchants with medals, in beards and dark blue caftans. In the hall of the second in the hall of the assembly of the nobility, there was noise and movement. The most important dignitaries sat on high-backed chairs around the table under the portrait of the sovereign, but the majority walked about the room. All the nobility, the same ones Pierre saw every day, now in the club, now in their homes, were in uniforms, some of Catherine's time, some of Paul's, some in... And this general character of the uniform lent something strange, and especially striking were the old men, a little fat or ship. They attached them, and if they walked and talked, they attached themselves to someone younger. Just as on the faces of the crowd Petya had seen in the square, so on all these faces, where the face was a striking feature of contrast, a general expectation of something solemn and the ordinary and everyday, a game of Boston, Petrushka the cook, Zinaida Dmitrievna's health, and so on. Pierre, squeezed since morning into an uncomfortable nobleman's uniform which had been too tight for him, was there in the halls. He was excited. The extraordinary assembly, not only of the noblemen, but of merchants as well, of Estats Généraux, called up in him a whole series of thoughts, long abandoned but deeply imprinted in his soul, about the contrat social and the French Revolution. The words he had noticed in the appeal that the sovereign would come to the capital for consultations with his people confirmed him in this view. And supposing that something important in that sense was approaching, something he had long awaited, he walked about, observing, listening to what was said, but not finding anything anywhere in an expression of those thoughts that interested him. The sovereign's manifesto was read, evoked raptures, and then everyone wandered about talking. Besides ordinary interest, Pierre heard talk of where the marshals of nobility were to stand when the sovereign entered, where to give the ball for the sovereign, and whether it should be done by districts or by the whole province, and so on. But as soon as things touched upon war and what the nobility was assembled for, the talk would become indecisive and indefinite. Everyone wished more to listen than to speak. A middle-aged man, manly, handsome, in the uniform of a retired naval officer, spoke in one of the halls, and a crowd formed around him. Pierre went over to the circle around the speaker and began to listen. Count Ilya Andreevich, in his caftan of a governor from Catherine's time, who was strolling with a pleasant smile among the crowd, with all of whom he was acquainted, also went over to this group and began listening with his kindly smile, as he always did, nodding approvingly to indicate his agreement with the speaker. The retired naval officer was speaking very boldly. That was evident from the expression of the faces of his listeners, and from the fact that people known to Pierre as a most submissive and quiet objected or walked away from him disapprovingly. Pierre pushed his way in the middle of the circle, listened, and became convinced that the man speaking was indeed a liberal, but in a quite different sense than Pierre had thought. The naval officer spoke in that especially resounding, melodious nobleman's baritone, pleasantly swallowing his R's and dropping consonants, that voice in which one calls out, "You heath a pipe," and the like. He spoke with a voice accustomed to both revelry and authority. "So what if Smolensk has offered the sovereign a militia? Does Smolensk lay down the law for us? If the honorable nobility of Moscow province find it necessary, they can show their devotion to the sovereign emperor some other way. We cannot forget the militia of the year 7, the ones who profited from this. It were little church folk and thieving robbers." Count Ilya Andreevich, smiling sweetly, nodded his head approvingly. "It was our militia of that use in the country? None at all. It just ruined our husbandry. Conscription's better, because when they come back, they're not soldiers, not peasants. They're sheer depravity. The nobility won't spare their own lives. We'll go ourselves to the last man. We'll conscript more soldiers, and the sovereign, that was how he said sovereign, only needs to sound the call, and we'll all die for him," the orator added with inspiration. Count Ilya Andreevich gulped with pleasure and nudged Pierre, but Pierre also wanted to speak. He moved forward, feeling inspired, not knowing by what himself, and not knowing himself what he was going to say. He had only just opened his mouth to speak when one senator, completely toothless, with an intelligent and angry face, who was standing near the orator, interrupted Pierre. With an obvious habit of leading the debate and sustaining questions, he spoke softly but audibly. "I suppose, my dear sir," said the orator, maundering with his toothless mouth, "that we have been summoned here not in order to discuss what is more appropriate for the country at the present moment, the conscription or a militia. We have been summoned to respond to the appeal the sovereign has deigned to make to us. We can let higher authorities judge what is more opportune, conscription or militia." Pierre suddenly found an outlet for his inspiration. He rose up against the senator who had introduced this correctness and narrowness of view into the tasks facing the nobility. Pierre stepped forward and stopped him. He did not know himself what he was going to say, but he began with animation, from time to time breaking into French words and expressing himself bookishly in Russian. "Excuse me, Your Excellency," he began. Pierre knew the senator well, but considered it necessary to address him officially. "Though I do not agree with the gentleman," Pierre hastily wanted to say, "mon très honorable préompétent," with the gentleman, je n'ai pas l'honneur de contraire, but I suppose that the estate of the nobility, besides expressing its sympathy and delight, has also been summoned to discuss the measures by which we may help the fatherland. I suppose," he has said, becoming inspired, "that the sovereign himself would be displeased if he were to find in us only owners of peasants whom we give to him, and chair à canon, which we make of ourselves, and we do not find in us any counsel." Many walked away from the circle, seeing the senator's contemptuous smile and that Pierre was speaking literally. Only Ilya Andreevich was pleased with Pierre's speech, as he had been pleased with the speech of the naval officer, the senator, and generally always with the speech he had last heard. "I suppose that, discussing these questions," Pierre went on, "we should ask the sovereign, most respectfully ask His Majesty, to communicate to us how many troops we have and in what position our troops in the army find themselves, and then—" But Pierre had not managed to finish these words when he was suddenly attacked from three sides. The strongest attack came from his old acquaintance, the Boston player, Stepan Stepanovich Apraxin, who had always been ill-disposed towards him. Stepan Stepanovich was wearing a uniform, and either because of the uniform or for some other reason, Pierre saw a completely different person. Stepan Stepanovich shouted at Pierre, "First, I put it to you that you have no right to ask the sovereign of that, and second, if the Russian nobility did have that right, the sovereign could not answer." Increase, another voice of a man of medium height, about 40 years old, whom Pierre in the old days used to see at the gypsies, and known for a dishonest card player, and who, also changed by his uniform, moved closer to Pierre, interrupted Apraxin. "And this is not the time for debate," said the voice of this nobleman. "We must act. There's war in Russia. The enemy is coming to destroy Russia, to defile the graves of our fathers and carry off our wives and children." The nobleman beat his chest. "We'll stand up. We'll go to the last man for our dear Tsar," he cried, rolling his bloodshot eyes. Several approving voices were heard in the crowd. "We're Russian. We won't spare our blood to defend the faith, the throne, and the fatherland. And the raving has to stop. If we are the sons of the fatherland, we'll show Europe how Russia rises to defend Russia," cried the nobleman. Pierre wanted to object, but he could not say a word. He felt that the sound of his words, regardless of the thought they contained, would be heard less than the sound of the animated nobleman's words. Ilya Andreevich approached from the outside circle. Some briskly turned their shoulders to the orator at the end of each phrase and said, "Right, right, that's right." Pierre one approved from the outside of the circle. Some briskly turned their shoulders to the orator at the end of each phrase and said, "Right, right, that's right." Pierre wanted to say that he did not mind donating money or peasants or sacrificing himself, but that it was necessary to know the state of affairs in order to help in any way. But he could not speak. Many voices shouted and talked all at once, so that Ilya Andreevich had no time to nod to them all. And the group grew in numbers, broke up, came together again, and moved, with the buzz of voices to the large hall, to the large table. Pierre not only had not succeeded in speaking, he had been rudely interrupted, pushed aside, turned away from as a common enemy. This had happened not because they were displeased with the meaning of what he said. That had been forgotten after the great number of speeches that followed it, but because, for inspiration, a crowd needs to have a tangible object of love and a tangible object of hatred. Pierre had become the writer, came from the crowd, said that hell should be repulsed, flashes and thunderclaps, but that we were not going to be that child. Yes, thunderclaps, was repeated approvingly from the back rows. The crowd came to the large table at which sat the 70-year-old dignitaries in their uniforms and sashes, gray-haired and bald, almost all of whom Pierre had seen in their homes with their in the clubs over Boston. The crowd came to the table, not ceasing to buzz, one after another and sometimes two together, pressing up against the high backs of the chairs by pushing the crowd behind. The orators spoke. Those standing behind noticed things that the orators did not say and hastened to say them. Others, in the heat and closeness, racked their brains in search of some sort of thought and hastily spoke it. The old dignitaries whom Pierre knew sat and glanced now at one, now at the other, and their expression was, for the most part, said only that they found it very hot. Pierre, feeling excited in the general sense of a wish to show that it was all nothing to us, which was manifested more in sounds and facial expressions than in the meaning of their speeches, communicated itself to him well. He did not renounce his ideas, but he felt guilty of something and wanted to vindicate himself. I only said that it would be more appropriate if we were making donations when we know what's needed, he said, trying to outshout the other voices. The nearest little old man glanced around at him, but at once distracted by shouting that started at the other end of the table. Yes, Moscow will be surrendered. She will be our redeemer. And you're crushing me. Section 23. Just then, stepping briskly through the parting crowd of noblemen, in a general's uniform with a sash over his shoulder and his protruding chin and darting eyes, Count Rostopchin came in. The sovereign emperor will be here presently, said Rostopchin. I've just come from not much to discuss. The sovereign has deigned to assemble us and the merchants, said Count Rostopchin. Millions will pour from there, he pointed to the merchants' hall, and our task is to raise a militia and not spare ourselves. That is the least we can do. Deliberation more than quietly. They even seemed sad when, after all, were heard singly, one saying, I agree, and another, for the sake of variety, I am of the same opinion, and so on. The secretary was told to write down the resolution. Of Smolensk would donate 10 men per 1,000 with full equipment. The gentlemen of the session stood up as if relieved, scraping their chairs and walked about the hall to stretch their legs, some arm in arm and talking. The sovereign, suddenly spread through the halls, and the entire crowd rushed to the door. Down a wide passage between the walls of noblemen, the sovereign came into the hall faces. Pierre was standing rather far away and could not hear all that the sovereign said. From what he did hear, he understood only that the sovereign was speaking of the danger the country was in and the hopes he placed in the Moscow nobility. Another voice responded to the sovereign, telling of the resolution just arrived at by the Moscow nobility. Gentlemen, said the faltering voice of the sovereign. The crowd rushed and grew still. Pierre clearly heard the sovereign's voice, so pleasantly human and touched with emotion, saying, I have never doubted the zeal of the Russian nobility, but today it has exceeded my expectations. I thank you on behalf of the fatherland. Gentlemen, let us act. Time is most precious. The sovereign fell silent. The crowd began to press around him, and rapturous exclamations were heard on all sides. Yes, most precious, spoken like a Tsar, the sobbing voice of Ilya Andreich said from behind. He had heard nothing, and had understood it all in his own way. From the hall of the nobility, the sovereign passed into the hall of the merchants. He stayed there for about 10 minutes. Pierre, among the others, saw the sovereign come out of the merchants' hall with tears of tenderness in his eyes. As was learned later, the sovereign had just begun his speech to the merchants when tears gushed from his eyes, and he had finished in a trembling voice. When Pierre saw the sovereign, he was coming out accompanied by 2 merchants. One was a fat tax farmer, known to Pierre, and the other a mayor with a thin, narrow-bearded yellow face. Both were weeping. The thin one's eyes were filled with tears, but the fat tax farmer sobbed like a child and kept insisting, Take my life and my property, your majesty. Pierre had no other feeling at the moment except the desire to show that it was all nothing to him, and he was ready to sacrifice everything. He saw his speech with its constitutional tendency as a reproach to himself. He saw an occasion to smooth it over. Learning that Count Mamonov had donated a regiment, bazooka. Old Rostov could not tell his wife what had happened without tears, and at once agreed to Petya's demand and went himself to sign him up. The sovereign left the next day. All the assembled noblemen took off their uniforms, planted themselves at home or in the clubs again, and groaning gave their stewards orders about the. So that is the end of section 23 and takes us to the end of part 1. And I know it was a little bit short, but I think it'll be lovely to stop there just because then we can start fresh with the new part of part 2, the new part of volume 3 on Monday. It's so interesting. So Ilya Andreevich, also known as Count Rostov, is going to allow his younger son to join the militia, even though Petya is only 15 and he's like a sovereign. And it's funny how Tolstoy, I feel like he writes kind of like a little like snidely, like his comment at the end of that section about all the nobility gave orders to their stewards about the militiamen to send out, and and then went back to their daily lives, astonished at what they had, all that they had done. Like they all speak with all this like loud shouting about what needs to happen and all of this, but at the end of the day, they're not actually the ones going off to war. They're just like, yeah, we're going to send some of the people that we own, because their serfs were like slaves, in the sense that they were owned in America. Because they had their own houses and they could, marry and live their own lives, but they were owned in the sense that people could tell them, oh, you got to go over here, you got to do this, by the nobility, and or you have to pay us to farm the land, that sort of thing. So the nobility are like, yes, we're going to provide men. And so what are they? They're not going themselves. They're sending the people they own, and they're paying for it. And then they're like, wow, we did so much. All right, so let's have some champagne and start playing another card game. Like, it's crazy, but like it's funny, but that is basically how life still is in many senses. Like the wealthy, they're definitely not just enlisting them, and but they'll make all the decisions about going to war and what has to be done, and the sacrifices that have to be made, and then they'll feel very proud of themselves for having done it all once they've sent a bunch of other people off to war. So not much changes. What's that old verse? There's nothing new under the sun. Though it is interesting too. I was listening his comment about when Pierre said he knew many of them from their homes, and we're seeing them with their buffoons, and it's something that an interesting just little comment that would have probably seemed commonplace, but since how the world has changed in some ways, it sounds as though it was quite common for nobility to have, almost as one would think of like a court jester, like in a king's court, how you'd have someone who's supposed to be like the clown, who literally exists only to be there to be a goofball. And it seems like that's kind of like a normal thing in like Russian households at the time. Like each nobleman has his own buffoon that just lives at his house. And I think Natasha Rostov, like in some of her thoughts, there's like the there's the one that's with them, and I forget his name. But she, it's funny because she, grew up around him, and so she just doesn't even think of him as like a regular man. She's just like, he's just the buffoon. He's always there, and it's just, it's not like she would be like ashamed. He's like just like practically like a fixture in the household, like almost a member of the family, but not even like. Yeah, it's interesting that maybe that's something that has changed. I can't say many people keep an extra person around just to goof around, but maybe that's what we have social media for now. Yeah, that's my thought. So anyways, thank you guys for joining me for Quarantine Story Time. We'll see you on Monday, where we'll dig into Volume 3, Part 2. Have a great weekend. Stay safe and stay loving and just out there, people.